There's no denying it. The more I look into Tulip Mania, the more I think NFTs are the digital equivalent in the 21st century. The similarities are uncanny. So take a seat, get comfortable, and after this episode, I promise you won't be able to think about Tulip Mania without thinking about NFTs at the same time.
The attention economy pits you against me. Money makes no sense these days, and the robots are taking jobs. The planet is in peril, but we can set us free. Put our brains together if we lead with our hearts. Gotta take back control from the greedy and the corporate. Gotta take back control to the hands of the people. Collaborate and listen. We learn and we grow. Build the future that we want.
Welcome back to Tech Back Control. It's a new project I've started to explore the disruptions in tech that shift power into the hands of the people. If you want to get a feel for what this podcast and project is about, feel free to listen to the trailer first. Today I'm adapting a Twitter thread I wrote about NFTs, comparing them to the Dutch Tulip Mania of the 17th century. And if you think you've heard this story before, think again. This might surprise you. I think many people misunderstood Tulip Mania and the history. There's a tendency in the NFT space at least to want to defend NFTs because they're not like tulips. But the more I think about it, the more I think maybe they have more in common. Tulips were not actually a speculative mania, but instead they were a signal of cultural and economic movement. Tulips were interesting because they were new and rare, and in the 17th century they were completely new to Europe, coming in from Asia Minor via Turkey. Much like how people view NFTs today, these were novel and intriguing and surprising, and tulips, unlike native European flowers, were exciting and strange because they could suddenly and randomly change colour one year, becoming beautifully striped or speckled. They didn't know at the time that this was due to a virus, but to those collectors it felt random and special, like they'd been selected or they'd won a lottery and their tulip had evolved into this new and rare version. Plain white or yellow tulips were known as rags and considered pretty worthless, so as much as people think they were all overvalued, the pretty common ones were 10 a penny. But these rare striped tulips, the ones with the virus, they would attract a much higher price, prized for their uniqueness and their beauty. These were essentially the NFTs of the time, non-fungible tulips, and the tulip craze came at the zenith of the Dutch Golden Age, with new trade routes, new money, and a new class of merchants and craftsmen in the Dutch Republic. This new entrepreneurial and wealthy class started collecting paintings, and ceramics and silverware, and rare books, and even expensive scientific instruments, all just to express their new taste and identity and newfound wealth, and in some cases also as investments. It would be quite easy to compare the wealthiest and most successful of these new merchants and craftsmen to those who got into crypto early in 2011 with Bitcoin or 2015 with Ethereum. When historians examine the evidence, they find that the same people who bought these paintings and other luxury artifacts in the Dutch Golden Age also bought rare tulips as well. These weren't always speculative investments. Sometimes it was more of a social signal, a way of expressing membership to this new, sophisticated, international modern trade culture. I kind of think of these as the profile picture NFT equivalent of the 17th century. Some wealthy patrons would even have these tulips, these books or rare items included in their portraits, on display as a social signal and part of their identity. If you go around galleries, you'll see many portraits where those patrons are stood, carrying or next to these rare tulips in the background. So the myth of tulip speculation is pretty hard to find in historical evidence. I know it's popular in modern culture and we assume it's a fact, but there isn't much evidence. All trades took place in normal life with these tulips, in taverns or in neighbourhoods, not at the stock exchange. This was peer-to-peer. This was very much the decentralised finance of the 17th century. And far from being a frenzy of sales, in reality, historians rarely find the chain of buyers longer than 5. So these rare bulbs moved slowly, and often when a rare tulip found an owner who really appreciated it, it just stopped changing hands. But the most rare bulbs could cost a lot, that's true. And The most expensive changed hands for 5,000 guilders, which, to put it into context, is pretty much the price of a brewery at the time, so a lot of money. But this was extremely rare. This was very, very uncommon, and the historian Anne Goldgar found only 37 people who spent more than 400 guilders on tulips. So not a lot of transactions of such high value. This is in some ways another similarity to NFTs, in the sense that those sensational record-setting sales make great headlines, but the reality is that those sales are extremely uncommon. The crash for tulips was between 1636 and 1637, and it seems to have been due to oversupply and a wobbly futures market, not a speculative bubble as many people seem to quote. See, tulips only bloom for 3 weeks a year. You'll have noticed them just a few months ago. And people only exchange these tulips between May and August, which doesn't create the most stable market conditions. It's a very small trading window. And add to that the fact that tulips, unlike NFTs, keep reproducing every single year with no realization that this is a virus turning rags to riches. A price crash was all but inevitable at this point. And contrary to popular opinion, no one jumped into canals due to bankruptcy. In fact, historians struggle to find a single example of bankruptcy due to Tulip Mania. But funny enough, some people did go bankrupt years later, and that was due to speculation in land, stocks, and railways. It was the 1841 account by Scottish author Charles Mackay that actually created the Tulip Mania myth, 200 years after true events, so he had no context of them firsthand. But this author claims that the entirety of Dutch society went crazy over exotic tulips, leading to the crash and ensuing economic chaos. He called this the Tulipmania in his memoirs of extraordinary popular delusions and the madness of crowds. The irony, of course, for Mackay is that he ended up getting swept up by a real speculative bubble, where he was on the front lines cheering it on. See, the railway mania in 18th century Britain was one of the greatest and most destructive speculative bubbles we've ever seen. It doesn't get the headlines in the popular press now, but unlike the Tulip Mania, there's lots of evidence of many middle-class families on modest incomes losing everything after putting their entire savings into new railway companies during the mania. I can't help but feel this hubris sounds awfully familiar in today's news cycle. Pundits and commentators are quick to throw anecdotes about the risks of an NFT or crypto bubble, but those same people surprisingly missed the giant frauds like FTX or the impending banking crisis, even when it's right under their nose. So, I guess in summary it turns out NFTs and tulips may have had a lot in common. It just might not be what you thought. See, they were both adopted by essentially a new entrepreneurial class movement, led by merchants and craftsmen in whatever their new frontiers were. They both came from essentially a new trading technology. Tulips relied on the new maritime trade east, and NFTs run on this new blockchain-powered internet. They were attractive to collectors and artists, and valued for rarity and uniqueness. And in many cases, they were peer-to-peer traded between collectors, completely skipping out centralized exchanges. And together, they've both been given an unfair bad rep by the media of the time. So, is that it? Are we done? Not quite. You're probably wondering, why is this the relevant topic for Tech Back Control? Am I trying to sell you NFTs? No, absolutely not. This comparison is relevant not because of tulips or NFTs, but I think because of the wider historical context where both of these stories exist. See, Tulip Mania might be overblown and sensationalized, but the social, financial and commercial innovation and experimentation that was happening in the Dutch Republic during the 17th century is not that dissimilar to the changes we see globally today. During the time of tulips, there was a huge change and opportunity in the Dutch Republic, much of it stemming from new trade routes east, and this fueled many other innovations that went in parallel. The revolutionary technology of the time was maritime transportation, and the Dutch were pioneers in shipbuilding, leading much of the world not just in ship design, but in navigation and cartography too. Ships were made of wood, lots of wood, and the invention of wind-powered sawmills helped the Dutch become the leader in lumber production across Europe. And this new trading opportunity, this essentially unexplored market for them, meant they needed to fund these new adventures into the unknown. So, they invented the joint stock company, which spawned the famous Dutch East India Company. And where would you buy and sell these joint stocks? Well, in the newly invented Amsterdam Stock Exchange. So innovation was thriving here. And with all this new money flowing in, the Dutch revolutionised banking, with the Amsterdam Exchange Bank offering services that had never really been seen before in Europe. Now I know it sounds crazy, but a single financial institution that offers deposits, loans, and most importantly, currency exchange was pretty much unheard of in the early 17th century. Before these banks, the norm was moneylenders, pawnbrokers, and even shadier informal lending institutions, which I'll let you try and imagine what they're like. Instead of placing your trust with this mishmash of informal lenders, in the Dutch Republic, you could put your trust in these new banks, who adopted double-entry bookkeeping from the Italians and made it their standard for financial record-keeping. And alongside all these modern banking services, the Dutch developed new insurance practices for maritime and fire risks, which I'd imagine are pretty essential when the biggest growth industry is international trade over enormous distances on big wooden ships. As you can see, this isn't really about tulips. The 16th and 17th centuries were the Dutch Golden Age, and I don't know if the 21st century is necessarily our golden age, but for some people, I'm sure it feels like it. I imagine those Dutch merchants, craftsmen, artisans, artists, collectors, and traders who were quick to seize the value of these expansive trading routes and all the related shipbuilding and finance industries. I bet they felt like they were on the cutting edge of technology and modern society. For many of them, within a generation, they suddenly had access to better financial services, more efficient and reliable access to money, and greater access to the world, and all the resources and prized cultural artifacts it contains. They were immersed in huge innovations in trade, technology, finance, and economics. The world had dramatically changed, and they were out in front, in the driving seat. The richest among them wanted Rembrandts, Vermeers, Japanese ceramic bowls, ancient books and cutting-edge microscopes, and, for some of them, rare striped tulips. Fast forward 400 years, and our golden age promises unimaginable opportunity, at least for those on the front line. We're having our own revolution in technology, trade and finance, much of the topics that I cover in this project. Our big innovation isn't transporting goods across the seas, but instead it's data and value across the internet. We're not finding better ways to build ships, but instead letting intelligent code build anything. And our future isn't intermediated by new banks, but instead by infallible bookkeeping code running on the internet. The latest ventures, they don't even need to sell shares on the stock exchange. Some of these internet protocols are owned and governed by thousands of people, all handled by the internet's infallible bookkeeping code, which cannot be stopped and never sleeps. So, our modern day equivalents of the Dutch merchant class are the investors, creators, artists, developers and traders, the ones on the front line of the next internet age. Some people are knee-deep in this new frontier and making money, losing money, experimenting, taking crazy risks and discovering a whole new world of possibilities via the open internet. And much like those Dutch pioneers before them, these people are collecting NFTs. NFTs which sail across the seas on new internet-powered trading routes. So, next time you hear someone refer to Tulip Mania, you might want to think a bit differently about it. Tulips are just like NFTs. It doesn't mean it's a bubble or mania. It might just mean something big is happening and the people buying them are excited because of what they're discovering on the front lines of a new era of trade, enterprise and innovation. If you're interested in learning more, as usual, I'll share all the links in the show notes. I had fun making this episode, so if you enjoyed it, please do leave a review on whatever podcast app you're using. And if you want to get more involved in the conversation, feel free to join the Discord. This episode was written, recorded and edited by me, Jonathan Tipper. The theme song is by Jonathan Mann, and the backing soundtracks are all from Epidemic Sounds. The artwork from this episode was created using Midjourney. Much of the evidence for this episode relies heavily on the historian Anne Goldgar and her research on Tulip Mania. You can find the links to her books, articles and an interview she did on the More or Less podcast a few years ago in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.